On the morning my son-in-law told the whole family I was too old to understand paperwork, I was standing 3 feet from him, holding a teapot. "She's too old to understand paperwork," Vuong said, not even lowering his voice. He said it the way a man announces the weather, easy and certain, like it cost him nothing. Around him, my daughter Tram sat frozen at the table, her chopsticks halfway to her mouth. My grandson kept eating as if nothing had happened, because to a 9-year-old, nothing had. Only I understood what those words meant, and only I understood what they were about to cost him. I set the teapot down. I did not spill a drop. Then I smiled. Not a wide smile. Just a small lift at the corner of my mouth, the kind of smile a person gives when they've heard a joke they've already heard before, told by someone who doesn't know it's a repeat. Vuong glanced at me, waiting for something. An argument, maybe. Tears. The kind of confusion that makes an old woman easy to steer. I gave him none of it. I only poured tea into his cup, careful not to let it overflow, and sat back down across from him at my own table, in my own house, beneath the portrait of my husband, whose eyes had been watching this exact chair for 11 years. Nobody at that table understood why I wasn't angry. Tram kept glancing at me sideways, waiting for me to defend myself, to say something about the 30 years I had spent behind a government desk, stamping seals onto land deeds and business licenses until my fingers knew the weight of an official document, the way a mother knows the weight of her own child. She didn't understand that some silences are not surrender. Some silences are simply a woman deciding it isn't yet time to speak. The morning went on as if nothing unusual had occurred. The rice cooker clicked off. My grandson asked for more fish sauce. Outside, a moped sputtered past on the lane, and somewhere down the block, a rooster crowed too late in the day, confused about its own schedule the way roosters near the city always seem to be. I drank my tea slowly. I let the steam rise into my face and did not blink. But my mind had already left the table. It had gone back 3 months, to the hospital bed where I lay recovering from a fall I still didn't fully remember. Machines beeping beside me in a rhythm I'd grown to hate, my daughter's face pale with worry each time she visited. I remembered how Vuong had come only twice. I remembered how, both times, he had not asked about my health so much as about my paperwork where I kept things. Which drawer, which folder, which box beneath which shelf. At the time I had thought it was concern. An educated man wanting to be useful. Now I understood it had been reconnaissance. I remembered too the pharmacy. Duke Anne, my husband had named it, after his father, a small shop with a green awning that had stood on the corner of our street for 30 years, through 2 currency changes, through a typhoon that took the roof off the noodle shop next door but left our sign standing. My husband had built that pharmacy from nothing, filed every form himself in the years before I even worked for the district, and when he died, the paperwork had passed quietly into my keeping, the way small, important things pass between people who trust each other without needing to say so. Vuong had married my daughter 4 years ago in a ceremony under red lanterns, promising, as young men do, to honor this family. He had smiled a great deal at that wedding. He had bowed to my husband's portrait with real tears in his eyes, or tears that looked real enough that I had believed them. I did not believe them anymore. Outside the window, the wind moved through the old tamarind tree in the yard, the one my husband had planted the year our daughter was born. Its leaves made a sound like paper turning, like pages being read by someone who thought no one else could hear. I looked past Vuong's shoulder at the incense on the ancestor altar. 3 thin sticks burning low, their smoke rising in a soft gray thread that bent, straightened, and bent again, following some current in the air none of us could see or name. I thought, an old bamboo does not break in a storm. It bends low enough to let the wind pass over it, and when the wind is finished, it is still standing, and the trees that refuse to bend are lying broken all around it. Vuong was still talking. He was telling Tram something about a licensing renewal, about how these government offices were slow and confused these days, about how it would be easier, simpler, more efficient if the pharmacy's paperwork were handled by someone with, and here his eyes flicked toward me for just a moment before flicking away, someone with a clearer mind for modern procedures. I refilled his tea again. My hand did not shake. 30 years of stamping seals onto documents that could make or unmake a family's future had taught me something about hands that they betray you before your face does. that a trembling hand tells the room everything your calm expression is trying to hide. So I kept mine steady, wrapped around the teapot's worn handle, warm from the water inside it. And I watched my son-in-law explain to my daughter, in my own house, beneath my husband's watching eyes, why an old woman who had spent 3 decades protecting the integrity of official records could no longer be trusted with her own family's paperwork. He did not know what I had already noticed, 3 weeks earlier, folded inside a drawer I kept locked out of habit rather than suspicion. He did not know that a woman who spends 30 years reading signatures learns to recognize the shape of a lie even when it wears a familiar hand. He did not know that I had already begun, quietly, the way water begins to wear down stone, to understand exactly what he had done. My grandson finished his rice and asked to be excused. Tram nodded absently, still watching me, still waiting for the argument that wasn't coming. I told the boy to go wash his hands, and he ran off through the back door into the yard, his small feet slapping against the tile, chasing something only children can see. The house grew quiet again. The tea had gone lukewarm in my cup, and still I did not drink it. Vuong stood, satisfied with whatever he believed he had accomplished, and walked out toward the front gate, calling over his shoulder that he had business to attend to downtown, at an office whose name he did not say. Tram watched him go, then turned to me, her mouth opening as if to apologize, or to explain, or to ask the question that had been sitting in her eyes since breakfast began. "Ma, why didn't you say anything?" I only shook my head, once, and reached for the small notebook I kept beside my chair, the same worn notebook I had carried into every government office for 30 years, its corners soft from handling, its pages filled with dates and names and numbers that meant nothing to anyone but me. I opened it to a blank page and began, very slowly, to write. Behind me, the incense had burned down to its last inch, its smoke thinning into the quiet air of the house, and I thought again of the bamboo grove behind my childhood home, how the storms came every year without exception, and how the stalks that survived were never the tallest or the strongest. They were only the ones that knew when to bend. My husband used to say that a house without incense smoke was a house that had forgotten how to breathe. I think of that now more than I used to. Before Vuong, before the hospital bed, before I learned to read the shape of a lie in a signature, my days moved in a rhythm so steady I never once thought to be grateful for it. That is the trouble with a good life. You live inside it the way you live inside your own skin, without noticing its weight until someone tries to take it from you. Duke Than, my husband, was a quiet man, though not in the way people mean when they say that about someone shy or withholding. He was quiet the way a well-built house is quiet, solid, unhurried. He spoke only when a thing needed saying, and when he did speak, people leaned in, because they knew the words had been chosen with care. I met him when I was 23, newly assigned to the district land registry office, and he came in every week for a year on some pretext or another, a boundary dispute that didn't exist, a form that needed no correcting, until finally I told him, not unkindly, that he was wasting government paper. He laughed for the first time in front of me that day, and I decided, somewhere in that laugh, that I would marry him. We built this house together in the 3rd year of our marriage, on a plot of land his father had left him, a narrow strip between a noodle shop and a tailor's stall, close enough to the market that I could hear the fish vendors calling out prices before the sun had fully risen. Duke Than planted the tamarind tree in the yard the same week our daughter was born, digging the hole himself in the heat of an August afternoon, sweat soaking through his shirt, refusing my mother's offer to hire a boy to do it for him. "A tree planted by another man's hands doesn't belong to your daughter," he told me. "It has to come from mine. That tamarind tree is taller than the roofline now. Its shade falls across the kitchen window every afternoon around 4 o'clock, and I have never once, in all these years, closed the curtain against it." The pharmacy came 2 years after the tree. Duke Than had trained as a pharmacist in the years before the wars ended supply chains and scattered his classmates across the country. And when things settled enough to rebuild a life, he chose Duke, Ain, as its name, his father's given name, a small act of memory pressed into a signboard. I remember the morning he hung it above the door, a plain green awning, hand-lettered, nothing fancy. He stood in the street looking up at it for a long time, longer than the task required, and when I asked what he was thinking, he only said, "Now it's real." I filed the paperwork myself. That was my gift to him. The only dowry I had that mattered a government clerk's understanding of forms, of stamps, of which office required which copy in which order. I filed the original business license application in the spring of that year, carried it by bicycle through the rain to the district office, and watched the clerk behind the counter press the seal into the corner of the page. I still remember the sound it made, a small, definite thump, like a heartbeat confirming itself. For 30 years after that, I built my own career doing exactly that kind of work for other families, reviewing land deeds, verifying signatures, catching the small inconsistencies that separated an honest filing from a forged one. I was good at it. Not because I was clever, though I like to think I was, but because I paid attention. A signature rushed is different from a signature copied. A stamp, pressed with confidence, sits differently on the page than one pressed by a hand unsure of its right to be there. I learned these things the way a seamstress learns the weight of good silk against poor, not by being told, but by handling thousands of pieces of it across a working life. Tram was born the year after the pharmacy opened, and I remember carrying her on my hip through the shop on slow afternoons while Duke Thon weighed powders on his small brass scale, the two of us moving around each other in the narrow space without needing to speak, like dancers who had rehearsed a routine so many times it no longer required counting the steps. The altar came later, of course, after Duke Thon's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning 11 years ago, quietly, the way he did everything, sitting in his chair in the front room with the newspaper still open in his lap. I found him there when I came back from the market. I did not scream. I only sat down across from him, the way I had sat across from him 10,000 mornings before, and told him, out loud, that he could go now, that I would manage the rest. I built the altar myself, in the corner beneath the window where the afternoon light from the tamarind tree falls softest. His photograph sits there now, the one from our 30th anniversary, his mouth caught in that same rare laugh I fell for in the land registry office. I burn incense for him every morning before the household wakes. 3 sticks. Always 3. And I stand there for a moment in the smoke, and tell him whatever needs telling, which is not so different from what we did across the counter of his pharmacy, all those years ago, moving quietly around each other's silences. Tram married Vuong 4 years ago in this same front room, beneath this same altar, and I remember thinking, watching him bow to Duke Than's photograph with his palms pressed together, that my husband would have approved of him. Vuong had a way of speaking that made older women trust him instinctively, a softness in his voice, a habit of asking after your health before asking after anything he wanted. I had believed, back then, that this softness was simply his nature. I understand now that softness can be worn like a good coat, put on for the weather and taken off once you're safely indoors. But I did not know that yet, not in those early years. In those years, Vuong helped carry groceries in from the market without being asked. He fixed the leak in the kitchen roof one rainy season without mentioning the cost of the materials. He sat with me some evenings on the porch, listening or seeming to listen while I told him stories about the district office, about the families I had helped, about the small satisfactions of a life spent making sure the right names ended up on the right pieces of paper. I told him, one such evening, exactly where I kept the original documents for Duke Anne, the founding license, the annual renewals, the deed to the shop itself, everything Duke Thon and I had built folded carefully into a single locked drawer beneath the altar, close enough to my husband's photograph that I liked to think he was still keeping watch over it. Vuong had nodded, that evening, and said something about how important it was to honor a father-in-law's legacy properly. I remember feeling, at the time, a small warm pride that my daughter had married a man who understood the weight of what we had built. I think of that evening often now. I think of how easily I gave him the shape of the thing he would later try to take. Outside my window tonight, the tamarind leaves are moving in a wind that smells faintly of rain not yet arrived, and somewhere down the lane a dog is barking at nothing, or at something none of the rest of us can see. The first thing I noticed was small enough that I nearly forgave myself for missing it. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I came home from the hospital, and I had gone to the locked drawer beneath the altar to find the pharmacy's annual health inspection certificate, a routine matter, nothing more, a form the district office required renewed every year around this season. I kept a small brass key to that drawer on a string around my neck, tucked beneath my blouse where it had rested, unmoved, for 11 years. I unlocked the drawer, the way I always did, without thinking about the motion any more than I thought about breathing. The folder was there. That was the first relief. But the order was not. I am, and have always been, a woman who keeps her papers the way a good cook keeps her spices, each in its place, each within easy reach, each arranged so that a hand moving in darkness could still find the right one. The founding license sat always on top because it was the document I touched most often, the one I liked to hold sometimes in the evenings the way other women hold old photographs. Beneath it came the annual renewals, oldest at the bottom, newest just under the founding license, climbing upward through the years like rings in a tree. That Tuesday, the renewals were out of order, not badly, not in a way a careless glance would catch, but 3 years down from the top, a renewal from 4 years back sat where a renewal from 2 years back should have been, and the founding license itself, the one I touched most, the one that should have shown the soft wear of 30 years of handling, sat slightly askew in the folder, as though it had been lifted out and replaced by a hand that did not know its true resting place. I stood very still in front of that open drawer for a long moment, the incense from that morning's offering still faintly sweet in the air behind me, and I told myself the story a person tells herself when she does not yet want to know the truth. I had been careless, I thought. The fall, the hospital. Perhaps I had gone looking for something myself in those confused weeks after I came home, moving papers without remembering I had moved them. I wanted, very much, to believe that story. I did not lock the drawer again that night. Instead, I sat beside it on the low wooden stool Duke Thon had built decades ago, and I went through every document one by one, the way I used to review a stranger's land deed in the district office, checking not just what a page said but how it sat against its neighbors, how its creases matched or failed to match the folder that had held it for so many years. Everything was there. Nothing was missing. And yet something had been touched, examined, handled by fingers that were not mine. I thought of Wang's visits to the hospital. Twice, and both times his questions circling back, gently, patiently, to where things were kept. I told myself, still, that I might be wrong. An old woman with a fall behind her, and a heart still tender from a scare like that, can begin to see conspiracy in a stack of misfiled paper. I've watched that happen to others in my life. A mind that has spent decades trained to notice discrepancy can sometimes notice discrepancy that isn't there, the way a retired soldier hears gunfire in a slammed door. So I said nothing. Not to Tram, who would only worry uselessly, caught as she always was between her mother and her husband, wanting neither of us to be at fault. Not to Wang, who would only smile that soft, reasonable smile of his and ask if I was certain, if perhaps I was simply tired, if perhaps this was a thing that happened to women my age. I began, instead, to watch. It is a skill that does not leave you, watching. 30 years behind a government counter teaches you to notice the shift in a person's shoulders before they've finished lying to you, the half-second delay between a question and its answer that tells you the answer was rehearsed rather than remembered. I began to notice these things in Vuong the way I once noticed them in strangers filing land claims, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small accumulating grains, the way sand collects in the folds of a curtain left too long by an open window. He began asking, in the weeks that followed, about the pharmacy's finances. Not directly. Vuong never did anything directly. I would come to understand that about him fully only much later, but sideways, through Tram, through casual dinner conversation about how the shop must be a burden for me to manage alone at my age, how a man in the family with a head for business might take some of that weight off my shoulders. I would smile and change the subject, the way I had learned to change subjects with difficult customers decades ago, redirecting without confrontation, letting the moment pass without giving it the satisfaction of a reaction. But I watched him more closely after that. I watched the way his eyes moved around this house when he thought no one was tracking them, toward the altar, toward the drawer beneath it, toward the old cabinet in the pharmacy itself where the ledgers were kept. I watched him linger near the shop on his days off, offering to help the young assistant Duke Thane had trained years ago, a boy named Fook who managed the counter now that I came in only a few mornings a week. I watched Vuong's questions to Fook grow more specific about the license renewal dates, about who exactly held authority to sign for the business, about whether the paperwork was filed under my name alone or under some broader family arrangement. Fook, being young and trusting, answered everything. I found this out only because Fook mentioned it to me himself one morning, without any sense that he had done wrong. Vuong had been by again, he said, asking good questions, taking real interest in how the shop was run. Fook seemed pleased by this, the way a young man is pleased when an older relative shows interest in his work. I smiled at him and thanked him for telling me, and said nothing more, though something in my chest had gone cold and still, the particular stillness I remembered from 30 years of catching a forged signature seconds before I would have stamped it as real. That evening, I went back to the drawer beneath the altar. I lit 3 sticks of incense first, out of habit, out of need, and stood for a moment in front of Duke Thon's photograph before I unlocked anything. The smoke rose in its usual thin gray thread, bending in the small current of air from the window, and I found myself speaking to him without meaning to, the way I sometimes did in the quiet hours when the house felt too large for one person. I think someone is trying to take what you built, I told him. I did not yet know how right I was, or how far that taking had already gone. I only knew, standing there with the key warm from my own skin still in my hand, that the drawer beneath our altar no longer felt like a place only I could reach, and that somewhere beyond these walls, in an office I had once trusted the way I trusted my own handwriting, a piece of paper with my husband's name on it, might already be moving toward a fate neither of us had given permission for. 3 days after Fook told me about Vuong's visits, I decided I would stop waiting to be told things and go find them myself. I have never been a woman who waits well. 30 years in a government office teaches you that waiting is what happens to people who have given up their right to ask questions. And I had not given up that right, no matter what my son-in-law seemed to believe about the sharpness left in an old woman's mind. So on a Thursday morning, while Tram was at her office downtown and Vuong had told the household he had a meeting he did not name, I put on my good blouse, the pale blue one I once wore to district functions, and I took the early bus to the licensing division of the City Department of Health. I had not set foot in that building in years, not since my retirement, but my body remembered the walk from the bus stop the way a hand remembers a familiar door. The department had moved to a newer building since my time, glass and tile, instead of the old concrete I remembered, but the smell inside was the same dust and old paper, and the particular ink of government stamps, a smell I had spent 30 years breathing without noticing until I'd been away from it long enough to notice its absence. I asked at the front counter for a young clerk I did not recognize, a woman perhaps 30 years old with tired eyes and a stack of folders beside her that suggested a morning already gone badly. I told her I wished to view the current licensing file for Dukan Pharmacy, as the elder proprietor listed on record. She asked for identification, which I provided, along with my old district registry card, worn soft at the corners, more out of habit than necessity, a small reminder, perhaps to myself as much as to her, that I understood these procedures from the other side of the counter as well as this one. She typed the pharmacy's name into her computer. I watched her face, the way I used to watch the faces of clerks handling my own files decades ago, looking for the particular stillness that comes before someone delivers information they suspect will not be welcome. "I'm sorry," she said. "This file shows a pending transfer of ownership. I can't release full documents on a file under active transfer without the current listed applicant present or written authorization." The words landed in me the way cold water lands on skin, not painful exactly, but total, immediate, impossible to ignore. "Transfer to whom?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She hesitated, glancing at her screen, then at me, weighing something I recognized instantly because I had weighed the same thing myself 100 times. Across that same kind of counter, how much could she say to a woman whose name was still, for now, on the file, but who was not the one listed as requesting the change? "I can tell you the application was submitted 6 weeks ago," she said finally. "I can't release the applicant's name without proper authorization. I'm sorry. If you're the current holder of record, you'd need to file a formal request to view pending transfer documents, or come back with someone from the review office. 6 weeks. I did the arithmetic in my head without meaning to, the way a clerk's mind does arithmetic automatically, and the number that came back to me was worse than I wanted it to be. 6 weeks ago was 2 weeks after I came home from the hospital, 2 weeks after Vuong's second visit to my bedside, with his soft questions about drawers and folders. 2 weeks after I had, in my own foolish trust, told him exactly where everything was kept, I asked, carefully, who in the review office I might speak with, and the clerk gave me a name, an officer named Miss Bick, who she said handled small business license transfers for this district. I wrote the name down in the small notebook I still carried everywhere, the same one I had used my whole career, and thanked the clerk for her time. I did not go home directly. I sat instead on a bench outside the building, beneath a flame tree not yet in bloom, and I let myself feel, for just a few minutes, the particular fury of a woman who has spent her whole life trusting the paper trail and has just discovered the paper trail moving without her. 6 weeks. A pending transfer. An applicant, whose name a government clerk would not say to me, because I was no longer, in the eyes of that file, entirely certain to be the one with the right to ask. I thought of my husband's photograph on the altar, of the 3 sticks of incense I burned for him every morning, of the drawer beneath that altar where I had believed, foolishly, that our life's work was safe simply because it was locked. A lock means nothing against a person who was handed the key's location freely, over tea, on a quiet evening, by a wife who believed her son-in-law's interest in her stories was affection rather than reconnaissance. I rode the bus home in silence, watching the city move past the window motorbikes weaving through afternoon traffic, a woman selling lotus seeds from a basket at a red light, 2 schoolgirls laughing over something on a phone screen, all of it ordinary, all of it continuing exactly as it always had, while somewhere in a government office a piece of paper with my dead husband's legacy on it sat waiting to change hands without my knowledge or my consent. When I reached the house, I did not go inside immediately. I stood in the yard beneath the tamarind tree for a long moment, looking up through its branches at the thin strips of sky between the leaves, gathering myself the way I used to gather myself, before walking into a difficult meeting at the district office breath by breath, until my face was calm enough to give nothing away. Inside, Tram was already home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, her phone face down beside it, in a way that told me she had just set it there. Quickly, at the sound of my footsteps, "Ma," she said, and something in her voice made me stop in the doorway. "Where were you today?" I did not answer right away. I studied her face instead, the way I had learned to study faces across 30 years of counters and forms, and I saw, beneath her carefully casual tone, something I had not expected to see there. Not suspicion of me, fear. The particular fear of a daughter who has just learned something about her husband that she does not yet know how to carry, and does not yet know whether to bring to her mother or bury in silence, hoping it will resolve itself before anyone else has to know. "I went for a walk," I said. "The market, nothing important." She nodded, too quickly, and reached for her phone again, turning it face down once more without looking at the screen. And in that small unconscious gesture I understood, with total certainty, that my daughter already knew something. The only question left was how much. I did not press Tram that evening. 30 years of watching people across a counter had taught me that fear given no room to breathe will only harden into silence, and silence was the last thing I could afford from my own daughter. Instead, I made dinner as I always did, and I let 2 more days pass in the ordinary rhythm of the house rice cooking, the tamarind tree dropping its small leaves onto the porch step. My grandson's homework spread across the kitchen table each evening while Vuong sat nearby scrolling through his phone with the particular ease of a man who believes himself untouchable. I watched him during those 2 days the way I once watched a nervous applicant across the district counter, waiting for the moment his composure would slip even slightly. It slipped on the 3rd night, though not because of anything I did. Tram came to my room after Vuong had gone to bed, close to midnight, still in her day clothes, her eyes red in a way that told me she had been crying somewhere private before she found the courage to knock on my door. I was sitting up reading, the small lamp beside the altar throwing soft light across the room, and when she sat down on the edge of my bed without being invited, I set my book aside and waited. "I found something," she said, on his laptop. "He left it open by accident. I wasn't looking for anything, Ma. I promise you, I wasn't looking." I told her I believed her, which was true, and I told her to breathe, which she needed more than she needed my belief. What she had found, she told me, her voice dropping lower with every sentence, as though the walls themselves might carry the words back to her husband, was an email exchange between Vuong and a woman named Bích, the same name the clerk at the licensing office had given me 3 days earlier, the officer who handled small business transfers for our district. Tram had not understood at first what she was looking at. A string of messages, professional in tone, discussing scheduling, discussing documentation, discussing something called an expedited review. Then she had scrolled further back, to messages sent nearly 2 months ago, and the tone had changed. They know each other from before, Tram said. From university. He mentioned it once, years ago, some friend from his hometown who went into government work. I never thought about it again until I saw her name on his screen. She stopped, twisting her hands together in her lap. Ma, there's a message where he tells her the current documentation on file is, and this is his word, not mine, outdated. He says the original founder is elderly and no longer capable of managing the business properly. He asks her what would be needed to process a transfer more quickly, given the circumstances. I sat very still. Outside, the wind moved through the tamarind tree, and somewhere down the lane a moped passed, its engine fading into the deeper quiet of the night. Given the circumstances, I repeated. Tram nodded, unable to look at me now, her eyes fixed instead on the folds of the blanket beneath her hands. He means the hospital, Ma. He means your fall. He used it. He told her you weren't capable anymore, and he asked her to help move things faster. I had suspected the shape of this betrayal for weeks, ever since the drawer beneath the altar had shown me its small disturbances, ever since the clerk at the licensing office had spoken the words pending transfer with a caution that told me more than her silence ever could have. But suspicion and confirmation are different animals entirely. Suspicion allows a small mercy, a door left open through which a person can still walk back into innocence. Confirmation closes that door. Is there more? I asked, because I already understood there would be. Tram's hands tightened further into the blanket. There's a message from her, from Bích, about 10 days ago. She says the standard process would normally require the current title holder's notarized consent, or, and I remember this word exactly because it frightened me, an affidavit confirming incapacity, signed by 2 witnesses and a licensed physician. If the holder is unable to provide consent directly, the room seemed to tilt very slightly, though nothing in it had moved. An affidavit of incapacity. I understood the phrase the way I understood every phrase in that world. From 30 years of reading exactly this kind of language across exactly this kind of desk, I understood what such a document could do to a person, how completely it could erase a lifetime of ownership with 2 signatures and a doctor's stamp. How a woman who had spent decades verifying the soundness of other people's minds and other people's paperwork could, with the right document and the right signatures, be declared unfit to manage her own. There's one more thing, Tram said, and something in the way she said it made my chest go cold before she had even finished the sentence. He asked her, in the most recent message, whether an affidavit could be arranged even without your presence at the appointment. If the doctor's evaluation could be, his word again, Ma, streamlined, using medical records already on file from the hospital. I thought of the hospital bed. I thought of Wong's 2 visits, his soft, careful questions. Not about my health at all, I understood now, but about which doctor had treated me, which forms I had signed upon admission, which records existed somewhere in a filing system he had already begun, quietly, methodically, to make his own. When was this message sent? I asked. My voice had gone very quiet, the particular quiet I remembered from my own working years, the voice I used when a stranger's forged signature sat directly beneath my hand and I understood, with total clarity, exactly what I was looking at and exactly what it would take to prove it. Tram looked up at me then, and in her face I saw not only fear but something close to horror, the dawning recognition of a daughter realizing that the man she had married was not simply careless or opportunistic, but had been building something, brick by careful brick, for weeks. 3 days ago, she said, Ma, he's already asking her if it's possible to file the affidavit this week. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The lamp beside the altar hummed faintly, the way old lamps do, and my husband's photograph watched us both from its frame with that same rare laugh caught forever on his face. as if some part of him found the whole arrangement absurd. A government clerk's own daughter, married to a man now trying to use the machinery of the very system her mother had spent 30 years protecting. I felt, beneath the cold clarity settling over me, something else stirring, not panic, but a kind of grim recognition, the recognition of a woman who has spent her working life learning exactly how these documents move, exactly which offices they pass through, exactly how long a signature takes to travel from one desk to another before it becomes irreversible. Vuong believed he was moving quickly. He did not understand that speed, in a bureaucracy, is not the same as certainty, and that a woman who had spent 3 decades inside that bureaucracy knew precisely where such a process could still be slowed, if she moved carefully and did not waste a single day. "Ma," Tram said again, her voice breaking now, the fear finally overtaking whatever composure had carried her this far. "What is an affidavit of incapacity going to do? What happens if he gets it signed?" I reached over and took her hand, the way I had not done since she was a small girl, frightened of a thunderstorm, and I held it there in the lamplight while I turned the question over, weighing it the way I once weighed a forged deed against a certified one, searching for the exact point where the fraud would show its seams. "It means," I said slowly, "that in the eyes of the law, I would no longer be considered capable of managing what your father and I built. It means Vuong would no longer need my consent for anything, not the pharmacy, not this house, not the drawer beneath your father's altar." Tram's hand went rigid in mine. "But Ma," she whispered, "you're the sharpest person I know. No doctor who actually examined you would sign something like that." I looked past her, toward the drawer beneath the altar, toward the photograph of my husband, still watching us both with his quiet, permanent laugh. And I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water finding the lowest point in a room, exactly what Vuong intended to do about that particular problem. "That," I said quietly, "is exactly why he wants it done without me in the room." I did not sleep that night, after Tram left my room. I lay in the dark listening to the house settle around me, the creak of the old roof beam above the kitchen, the sound of a neighbor's rooster starting too early and then going quiet, the distant hum of the city that never fully silences itself, even at 3 in the morning. I lay still and I thought, the way I had always thought through difficult problems at the district office, not with urgency but with patience, mapping each piece of what I knew against each piece of what I needed. By the time the first light began to show at my window, I had a plan. The first thing I needed was documentation of what the licensing file currently contained, not a second-hand account from a tired clerk, but a formal certified extract, the kind that carries an official stamp and a case number, and can stand on its own before any review board or legal body that might eventually need to look at it. For that, I would need someone inside the system, not Bixnock's division, which I had to assume was already compromised, but the Administrative Records Office, which operated separately, and maintained its own archive copies of every license ever issued. I knew a woman there. Her name was Lan Phuong, and she had started at the records office 2 years before my retirement, young enough then to ask me questions about filing procedures and old enough now, I hoped, to remember who had answered them. I had helped her navigate a complicated reclassification dispute in her second year, the kind of bureaucratic tangle that could have cost her the position if the wrong supervisor had noticed it first. She had thanked me with a box of sticky rice cakes and a card in careful handwriting. I had kept the card. I found her number through the department's public directory and called her that morning from the porch, while Vuong was still asleep and Tram was making breakfast with the deliberate quietness of a woman trying not to disturb anything further. The tamarind tree was gold in the early light, its leaves barely moving, and I kept my voice low and my words simple. Lan Phuong remembered me immediately, warmly, with that particular warmth people show toward someone who once kept them from drowning without making them feel like they had been drowning. I told her I was well. I asked about her family. Then I told her I had a professional question, a matter of verifying the provenance of an original filing, and I asked if she might have time to look at something for me in the next day or two. She said she could see me the following afternoon. That same morning, before Vuong came downstairs, I went quietly to the locked drawer beneath the altar. I removed the founding license, the original, in my husband's handwriting on the form we had filed together in the spring of a year now 3 decades past, and I photographed every page of it with my phone, carefully, under the lamp, making sure the edges of each seal and each signature were clearly visible. Then I took it to the small copy shop 2 streets from our house and had it duplicated on archival paper, 3 copies, each one sealed in a plastic sleeve. I kept the original locked on my person from that moment forward, tucked into the same inner pocket of my good bag where I had once kept my district registry card. The copies went to 3 separate places, one with Lan Phuong, one with my eldest sister across town, and one in the small safety box at the post office 2 neighborhoods away, where I had kept valuables since the year my husband's mother died, and we learned that family and proximity are not the same as safety. All of this I did quietly, across 3 days, moving through the city on the morning buses the way I had always moved through official spaces without announcement, without haste, without giving anyone watching me a reason to find my movements interesting. Phuong noticed nothing. This was not surprising. A man who had decided an old woman was no longer capable of managing her own affairs would not expect that old woman to be managing, with considerable precision, the legal foundation of his undoing. I thought, during those 3 days of quiet movement, of the lotus plant, how it roots itself in the muddiest water, how it pushes up through the dark from below, and how the flower that finally opens at the surface carries no trace of the mud that made it possible. My grandmother had kept a clay pot of lotus on her porch in the countryside, and she had told me once that the plant's secret was not its beauty but its patience, that it grew for weeks beneath the surface before it showed itself at all, and that anyone who watched the water and saw nothing had simply not yet learned to wait. I had learned to wait. I had learned it as a girl watching my grandmother's lotus pot, and I had learned it again across 30 years of government work, and I was applying it now with everything I had. On the afternoon I met Lan Phuong at the records office. She brought me to a small room off the main archive, where we could look at things without being in the open hall. She had already pulled the file before I arrived, efficient, discreet, the way good clerks are when they understand that discretion is itself a form of professional care. She laid the administrative copy of Duke Anne's licensing history on the table between us, and I opened it the way I used to open files across my own desk, slowly, from the beginning, without skipping ahead. The original founding license was there in the archive copy, exactly as it should be, stamped and dated and consistent with the document I had photographed and copied and locked away. That was the first relief. But when Lan Phuong turned to the most recent pages, to the section that recorded pending actions on the file, I saw what had been added since Phuong began his quiet campaign. A transfer application, filed 6 weeks ago. Applicant, Dang Hui Phuong, reviewer assigned, Tran Bichnok. And below that, in the notation field where a reviewer records the basis for expedited processing, 4 words that hit me with a force I had not expected even though I had been preparing myself to find something like them. Founder confirmed cognitively diminished. I read the line twice. Lan Phuong was watching my face the way a person watches a face when they are afraid of what expression it might produce, and I gave her nothing the same neutral attention I had given difficult documents for 30 years, the attention that processes without betraying itself. I asked her, very quietly, when that notation had been entered. She checked the timestamp on the screen, beside the paper file. 11 days ago, she said. The same day the transfer was submitted for final review. I sat back in my chair and looked, for a moment, at the window behind Lan Phuong's shoulder, at the plain rectangle of afternoon sky visible through the glass, and I understood, with complete clarity, that Bichnok had not waited for an affidavit to be properly filed. She had entered a notation in the file herself, an internal notation, not a formal legal document, not a physician's report, but a clerk's notation, the kind of small administrative observation that a rushed reviewer might accept as sufficient justification to proceed without looking any closer. It was not enough to hold up in a formal challenge, but it was enough to push a transfer through a system where no one was watching, if the right person was doing the reviewing and the wrong person had been told to stay out of the way. Lan Phuong, I said, my voice steady, is there a procedure for filing a formal objection to a pending transfer on the grounds of procedural irregularity? She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw her understand, in the way that good people sometimes understand things that are not quite said, exactly what she was being asked and exactly why. There is, she said. And if such an objection is filed before the transfer reaches final approval, the file goes into mandatory hold. Nothing can move until the irregularity is reviewed. I opened my notebook to a clean page and uncapped my pen. Tell me, I said, exactly how many days we have. She leaned forward and showed me the screen, and the date stamped there in the column marked Final Approval Deadline was closer than I had hoped, and yet just far enough away, if I moved now without a single wasted hour, that there was still a door left open. Just barely. But barely had always been enough for me. I had 4 days before the final approval deadline. I used 3 of them to file the procedural objection through Lan Fuang's office, gather the certified extract of the original founding license, and arrange a meeting with a legal aid officer who specialized in business disputes. I did all of this without telling Vuong, without telling Tram more than she needed to know at each step, and without allowing myself to move faster than the situation required. Speed makes noise. I needed silence. On the 4th day, Vuong made his move. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front gate open, not the small sound of a family member returning, but the wider, more deliberate sound of the gate being held back for someone who was not accustomed to opening it themselves. I dried my hands on the kitchen cloth and walked to the front room without hurrying. Vuong was standing in the doorway with 2 men I had not seen before. Both were dressed in the kind of business clothing that signals intention, rather than occasion: pressed shirts, dark trousers, folders tucked under their arms. One of them carried a briefcase. The other had the careful, sideways posture of a man trained to observe a room before entering it fully. "Ma," Vuong said, and his voice had changed. The softness was gone. What remained was something I recognized from 30 years of government work. The tone of a person who has decided that pleasantness has served its purpose and can now be retired. "These are colleagues of mine. We need to sit down and talk about the pharmacy." I looked at the 2 men. Neither of them smiled. The one with the briefcase glanced toward the altar, toward the drawer beneath it, with the quick professional assessment of someone who has been told in advance where the relevant items are kept. "Come in," I said. Because I had learned long ago that the worst thing a person can do when an opponent has decided to show their hand is to flinch before seeing all the cards. I gestured toward the sitting room. "I'll make tea." Vuong's mouth tightened slightly. He had not expected that. He had expected, I thought, some version of confusion or protest, or the kind of elderly agitation that would make the 2 men with their folders feel certain that what they'd been told about my condition was accurate. I gave him none of it. We sat. I poured tea from the pot I had already made, a thing I did every afternoon at this hour regardless of what else was happening in the world, and I set the cups down without spilling any. The man with the briefcase opened it on the low table between us. He produced 3 documents and arranged them in a row with the deliberate care of a person who has rehearsed this moment. "Mrs. No," he said. His voice professionally gentle in the manner of someone trained to speak to people they have decided are fragile. "We're here to assist with a transition of management for Duke Anne Pharmacy. This is a standard process for family businesses, where the original holder has reached an age where..." "Where what?" I said. He paused. "Where active management may benefit from additional support." I looked at the documents. The first was a transfer consent form, my name printed at the top, a signature line at the bottom. The second was a business management agreement, transferring operational authority to Dang Hu Vuong, effective immediately upon signing. The third was a document I recognized by its format. Before I had read a single word of its contents, it was structured exactly like the incapacity assessments I had seen filed in the district office over the years, the kind that required a physician's signature but which could, if the right notation had already been entered in the administrative file, be supplemented by a reviewer's professional judgment in cases where a formal medical evaluation was deemed impractical. Bickenjock's notation, founder confirmed cognitively diminished. This was what it had been for. Vuong leaned forward slightly, and I saw in his posture the particular confidence of a man who believes the difficult part is already done, and what remains is only paperwork. "Ma," he said. His voice softened again, selectively, the way a tool is picked up when needed and set down when not. "This is the right thing. You've worked hard your whole life. Just sign where they've indicated and everything goes smoothly. No complications. No complications." A man had entered my home with forged procedural grounds and documents, designed to erase my husband's name from a business he had built with his own hands. and he was describing this as the absence of complications. I looked at the signature line. I looked at the documents arranged in their careful row. Then I looked at Vuong, directly, in a way I had not done since the morning at the breakfast table when he had announced, without lowering his voice, that I was too old to understand paperwork. I looked at him the way I had looked at forged documents across 30 years of a working life, not with anger, but with the complete and focused attention of someone who knows exactly what she is seeing and exactly what it is worth. "Where did you get the incapacity notation?" I asked. The room went very still. The man with the briefcase stopped moving. The other man's sideways posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Vuong's expression did not change, but something behind it did a small involuntary adjustment, the kind a face makes when it realizes the ground has shifted in a way it was not prepared for. "That's a standard administrative," the first man began. "It was entered by the reviewing officer 11 days ago," I said, "without a physician's report, without my presence, and without a formal petition to the review board, which is required under current regulations when the basis for an expedited transfer is a claim of cognitive impairment. I know this because I spent 30 years in the District Land Registry office, and the procedures there mirror the ones used in licensing administration, and I reviewed similar filings every week for most of my career." Silence. Vuong's jaw moved once, as if he were about to speak. And then he did not speak. The man with the briefcase looked at the documents on the table. The other man looked at the wall. I stood, slowly, the way I always stood, without drama, without announcement, simply moving from seated to upright, the way a person does when a meeting has reached its natural conclusion. "I'll need you to leave now," I said. "I have an appointment this afternoon." Vuong stayed seated. His voice, when it finally came, had lost both its softness and its confidence, and what remained was something raw, something I had suspected was always beneath the surface. "You can't stop this," he said. "The file is already in final review. It goes through whether you object or not." I looked at him one last time from where I stood beside the tea tray, and I let the silence hold for exactly long enough that every person in that room understood I was choosing my words rather than searching for them. "The file," I said, "has been under mandatory hold since yesterday morning." I watched his face. It was the first time since any of this had begun that I saw Vuong look genuinely uncertain, not the performed uncertainty of a man pretending to reconsider, but the real thing, sudden and unguarded, the expression of someone who has just understood that the map he has been navigating no longer matches the terrain. He stood abruptly, and the two men stood with him, and the documents on the table sat there unsigned between us, and I thought, watching them gather themselves toward the door, that this was the moment a person either retreats entirely or becomes dangerous. I did not yet know which one Vuong would choose. Vuong walked out, without another word. The gate closed behind all three of them with a sound that was neither soft nor hard, simply final. I stood in the quiet that followed, the incense on the altar burning low behind me, and I felt the full weight of what had just happened settle into my hands and my shoulders, solid and real. But underneath it, something else was moving. Something I had not yet fully named. Because a man who has just discovered that his plan has been interrupted does not simply go home and accept the interruption. He finds another door. And I did not yet know which door Vuong was already moving toward. The door Vuong found was my daughter. I did not know this until the following evening, when Tram came to my room again, later than before, close to midnight. And this time she did not knock. She simply opened the door and stood in the frame, and the light from the hallway behind her made it impossible for me to read her face clearly, and something in the way she was standing very straight, very still, the way a person stands when they are holding themselves upright through effort rather than ease, told me, before she said a single word, that what she had come to tell me was going to cost her more than anything she had told me. "Yet, Ma," she said, "I signed something, 3 months ago. I need to tell you what I signed." I set down the notebook I had been writing in. I did not speak. I waited. She came into the room and sat on the edge of the chair beside the window, the one I had put there years ago for guests who stayed late, and she laced her fingers together in her lap and looked at them the way a person looks at something they are not yet ready to look away from. Because looking away means looking at whoever is waiting for the truth. "He told me it was a business modernization form," she said. "A document that updated the pharmacy's registration to reflect that the business was being managed by the family jointly. He said you had agreed to it in principle but that you'd been tired from the hospital and he didn't want to bother you with paperwork while you were still recovering. He said it was just an administrative update, that your name would still be on everything, that nothing would change except that he could handle the day-to-day licensing renewals so you wouldn't have to. The room was very quiet. Through the window, the tamarind tree moved in a slight wind I could not hear, only see. And the incense on the altar had burned down to nothing, 3 gray threads of ash, standing in the brass holder, like the memory of a flame. "Tram," I said. My voice came out very even, very low. "What did the document actually say?" She lifted her eyes then, finally, and looked at me, and in her face I saw not only guilt but grief, the specific grief of a person who has just finished understanding what they participated in and cannot undo their participation by understanding it. "It was a co-ownership declaration," she said. "It listed Deng Huivuong as co-holder of the business license, effective from the date of signing. With rights of survivorship." She stopped. "Ma, rights of survivorship means that if anything happens to the remaining original holder, if anything happens to you, the business passes entirely to him, without probate, without review." Automatically, I did not move for a long moment. I sat in my chair in the light of the small lamp, and I let the full weight of those words find their places inside me, one by one. The way water finds the cracks in old stone, slowly, inevitably, doing damage that is invisible at first and then suddenly, completely visible all at once. My daughter had signed away her father's pharmacy, not out of greed, not out of malice, out of trust in a man who had understood, with a precision that made me sick to consider, exactly how much a daughter would do for her mother's peace of mind, exactly how easy it would be to dress a theft as an act of care. "He showed you where I keep things," I said. "During the hospital visits. You told him." She pressed her lips together. A small sound escaped her, not a word, something quieter than that. "He asked," she said. "He said he wanted to help while you were recovering. He asked where the important papers were kept. And I told him about the drawer. And I told him about the key. I didn't think, Ma. I didn't know what he was planning. I thought he was trying to help." I looked at my daughter's face. I had looked at this face my entire life. I had watched it learn to smile, watched it learn to cry, watched it learn to compose itself into something adult and controlled. The face of a woman who had worked hard and built a careful life. And I watched it now, folded inward on itself with a grief it had no practice containing, and I understood, with the kind of understanding that has no comfort in it, that Tram had not betrayed me. She had been used by a man who had married her knowing, precisely and deliberately, that her love for me was the door he needed. That was the thing that moved through me then, not the anger I had been carrying for weeks, cold and purposeful and useful, but something larger and older than anger, something that started in my chest and moved outward through my arms and into my hands, which were resting on my knees, and which I noticed, distantly, were trembling slightly for the first time since this had all begun. Duke Thon had built Duke On with his own hands. He had named it after his father. He had stood in the street looking up at the green awning on the morning it opened, and said, "Now it is real," and I had filed the papers myself, carried them on my bicycle through the rain, and I had heard the seal come down on the founding license with a sound like a heartbeat. And that sound had meant something. It had meant that what we were building was real and recognized and ours, protected by the same system I had spent 30 years working inside of. And now a man who had sat at our table and bowed to my husband's photograph with performed tears had used my daughter's love to reach inside all of that and take it without my knowledge, without my consent, on a day when I was lying in a hospital bed and did not know I needed to be watching. I sat with all of this for a long time. The clock on the wall marked the minutes with its small steady sound. Tram did not speak. She only waited. The way a person waits when they understand that no words available to them are adequate to the moment and that silence, at least, does no additional harm. When I finally spoke, my voice was quieter than I expected it to be. "Do you still have a copy of what you signed?" She nodded, barely. "Did you sign it in front of a notary?" She shook her head. "He said we could have it notarized later. That for the initial filing, it only needed our signatures." I looked at the altar. My husband looked back at me from his photograph, permanently mid-laugh, and I thought of what he would have said about a document signed without notarization, submitted to a licensing office as the legal basis for a co-ownership claim. I thought of what I would have said 30 years ago if such a document had come across my own counter. I thought of what Lan Fuang's expression would be when she saw it. "Tram," I said, "go and get that copy. Right now, tonight. Bring it to me." She stood immediately, with the relief of someone who has been waiting to be given something useful to do. At the door she stopped, and I thought she was going to say something, an apology, maybe, or something she had been holding back across this entire conversation. But she only looked at me for a moment, in the way that daughters look at mothers when words have temporarily failed them, and then she went down the hall to find the document that her husband had believed was the final piece of everything he needed. He had not understood, when he asked her to sign it without a notary, without a witness who was not also his wife, without the procedural formality that gives a document its legal teeth, that he had made the one mistake I had spent 30 years learning to find. The copy she brought me 12 minutes later was exactly what I had expected. A document that looked, to a person unfamiliar with the requirements, entirely official. A document that was, to a person who had spent 30 years verifying exactly this kind of filing, fatally, irrevocably, and completely void. I held it in my trembling hands and felt, underneath the grief and the fury and the exhaustion of weeks of this, a single clear note of something else. Not victory, not yet, but the precise, quiet recognition of a woman who has just found, in the hands of the person who had tried to take everything from her, the document that was going to give it all back. I did not sleep that night either. But this time the sleeplessness felt different, not the heavy, restless kind that comes from dread, but the clean, alert kind that comes from having finally seen the full shape of what you are dealing with and knowing, precisely, what comes next. I sat at my desk until 3 a.m. with the void document, the certified licensing extract, the photographs of the founding license, and my notebook open to the page where I had written, in the orderly shorthand of 30 years of government work, every date, every name, every procedural irregularity I had found since this began. I arranged these things on the desk in the order they would need to be presented, and I looked at what I had, and I understood that it was enough. More than enough. The co-ownership declaration that Tram had signed was unenforceable for 3 reasons. Each one sufficient on its own, all 3 together, something no reviewing officer could overlook without committing a procedural violation serious enough to end a career. First, it lacked notarization, which under current licensing regulations was a non-negotiable requirement for any document transferring or amending business ownership rights. Second, it had been submitted to the licensing office by Vuong without disclosing that the co-signer was his legal spouse. A conflict of interest that required separate disclosure under family business regulations. Third, and this was the piece that made everything else collapse behind it like a wall with its foundation pulled out, the document bore a date 3 months in the past, but the administrative stamp on the received copy showed a filing date that was 11 days ago, which was 4 days after Bic Nock had entered her notation about my cognitive state into the system. A document filed after a reviewer's notation of incapacity could not legally be used to support that same reviewer's finding of incapacity. The notation and the document had been designed to prop each other up, each one providing the justification the other required. What Vuong had not anticipated was that a woman who had spent 30 years stamping and verifying documents of exactly this type would understand, the moment she saw that filing date, that the entire structure was circular, self-referencing, and therefore legally hollow. I closed the notebook. I looked at the altar. My husband looked back at me from his photograph, and I told him, quietly, in the dark of the room, that I was going to finish this now. In the morning, I called Lan Fuang before the household was awake. She answered on the second ring, and I could tell from the quality of her voice that she had been expecting to hear from me. I told her what I had found in the void document. I heard the small, controlled intake of breath that a careful government worker produces when they understand the scope of what they are looking at, and I told her what I needed from her office before the end of the week. She said she would have it ready by Thursday. My second call was to the legal aid officer I had met earlier, a man named Mr. Hugh, who had spent 22 years handling small business disputes and who had listened, during our first meeting, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned not to underestimate the person in front of them, regardless of what they look like or how old they are. I told him I had the void document and the filing date discrepancy. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the tone of a man choosing his next words carefully, that he thought we should move the formal complaint forward to the end of this week rather than the beginning of next. Thursday, I said. He said Thursday worked. My third call I made from outside the house, standing under the tamarind tree in the early morning light, with dew still on the grass beneath my feet. I called my eldest sister, who had kept one of my certified copies of the founding license and who had known my husband since before we were married, and I told her only that I needed her to be available on Thursday afternoon if I called. She did not ask why. She simply said she would be there. My sister has always understood, in the way that older sisters do, that when I say I need something, I have already thought through why I need it, and that questions can come later. I spent the next 2 days behaving exactly as I had behaved for the past several weeks, moving through the house in my ordinary rhythm, cooking the same meals at the same hours, drinking tea on the porch in the late afternoon, saying good morning to Vuong with the same measured politeness I had maintained since the day he arrived with his 2 colleagues and his briefcase full of documents I had not signed. I gave him nothing to read in my face. I gave him no change of pattern to notice. I was still water. I was exactly what he had always believed me to be, and I gave him every reason to continue believing it. He did not know that Lan Phuong's certified extract was sitting in her office with a notation of its own, a formal flag on the file, indicating that the co-ownership declaration was under procedural review for filing irregularity. He did not know that Mr. Hugh had drafted a formal complaint naming both Vuong and Biknook as parties to a falsified administrative process. He did not know that Tram had agreed, in writing, witnessed by my sister over the phone, to provide a sworn statement confirming that she had been misled about the nature of what she signed. He only knew that the mandatory hold on the file was still in place, and that I had, so far, done nothing with it. He seemed to have decided that this meant I was afraid, or confused, or simply waiting to be persuaded. On Wednesday evening, Vuong tried once more. He came to find me on the porch while Tram was putting their son to bed and sat in the chair across from me with his hands resting on his knees, and he looked, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely tired. The performance had slipped. What sat across from me was not the careful, soft-voiced son-in-law who had bowed to my husband's photograph. It was simply a man who had gone further than he intended to go and was not quite certain how to find his way back. "Ma," he said, "can we talk?" Honestly, I looked at him. I let him speak. He said that he had made mistakes, that he had let ambition get ahead of judgment, that he had not meant for things to go as far as they had with the licensing office, that Biknook had moved faster than he had asked her to, that the notation had not been his idea but that he had not stopped it when he should have. He said he understood if I was angry. He said he wanted to find a way to resolve things that didn't destroy the family. I listened to all of this. I watched his face while he said it, the way I had watched 100 faces across a government counter over 30 years, and I noted what was genuine in it. The tiredness was real, and some portion of the regret was real, and I noted what was not, which was the part where he was still, even now, hoping that the right combination of contrition and reasonableness might persuade me to let the complaint go unfiled before Thursday arrived. When he finished, I said only that I needed some time to think. He nodded, relieved, and went inside. And I sat alone on the porch in the cooling evening air, with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the tamarind tree move above me, and I thought about what he had said about not meaning for things to go this far. I had seen, across 30 years of government work, many people who had not meant for things to go as far as they went. The distance between intention and consequence is where most of the damage in this world gets done. I had spent my career watching that distance accumulate, document by document, signature by signature, until the gap between what a person meant to do and what they actually did became too wide to explain away with good intentions. Thursday was 1 day away. I had been still water for long enough. Thursday morning, I put on my best ao dye, the dark blue one, the color of deep water, the one I had worn to Duke Than's retirement banquet and to our daughter's wedding, and to every occasion that required me to walk into a room and be taken seriously. I pinned my hair. I put on the small jade earrings my husband had given me on our 20th anniversary. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment, and I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had spent 30 years learning how the system worked, and who had come today to use every piece of that knowledge in one room, in 1 hour, without raising her voice. I had asked Tram to arrange it, a family meeting, I had told her to say, something that needed all of us present. Tram had done this without question, with the particular quiet efficiency of a daughter who understands she owes her mother a thing and is grateful to be given a concrete way to pay it. Vuong arrived at the house at 2 in the afternoon expecting, I think, a negotiation. He brought no colleagues this time. No briefcase. No prepared documents. He came as a family member, which told me he had decided the professional approach had failed and that personal appeal was his remaining option. He sat at the table in his good shirt and managed a version of his old smile, the warm one. Mr. Hugh arrived 3 minutes after Vuong, and whatever calculation Vuong had been running in his head visibly recalculated. Lan Fuang arrived 2 minutes after that, carrying a folder with the city licensing office seal on its cover, accompanied by a colleague from her office who sat quietly in the corner with a notepad. My sister arrived last, and she sat beside me on my left, and she did not smile at Vuong, and she had not smiled at him in some time. I let everyone settle. I poured tea from the pot I had made that morning, the same pot, the same hour, the same careful pour I had performed every day of this ordeal without variation. I set the cups down. I sat at the head of my own table. Then I opened the folder I had prepared the night before, and I placed the first document at the center of the table where everyone present could see it. This, I said, is the original founding license for Duke and Pharmacy, filed in the spring 31 years ago. My husband's signature is on this line. My own is here, as the assisting applicant. The seal in the corner belongs to the district office where I worked for the following 3 decades. I looked at Vuong without expression. I know this document the way I know my own handwriting. I filed it myself. I carried it on a bicycle through the rain to make sure it reached the counter before the office closed. And I watched the clerk press this seal into the paper. And I remember the sound it made. I placed the second document beside the first. This is the co-ownership declaration submitted to the licensing office 11 days ago, bearing a backdated signature from my daughter, acquired without her full understanding of its contents, and without the notarization required by current regulation. I turned to Lan Fuang. Can you confirm the filing date on the administrative record? Lan Fuang opened her folder and read the date aloud. It was 11 days ago. It was 4 days after Bic Knock's notation. A co-ownership document cannot legally serve as the basis for a reviewer's finding of incapacity, I said. And a reviewer's finding of incapacity cannot legally justify the acceptance of an unnotarized co-ownership document submitted by a spouse without conflict of interest disclosure. These 2 documents were intended to support each other. They cannot. Each one invalidates the other. I paused. This is something I would have explained to any applicant who came to my counter with this kind of filing. In 30 years I explained it many times. I watched Vuong's face as I said this. I had been watching his face, in one way or another, since he sat down at my table for the first time 4 years ago, and smiled his careful smile. I had watched it perform warmth and perform concern and perform contrition. What was on it now was none of those things. It was the face of a man who has just understood that the room he entered expecting to leave through one door has no other door. I placed the third document on the table. This is the formal complaint filed this morning with the District Administrative Review Board, citing procedural irregularity in the handling of the Duke Anne licensing file, naming the reviewing officer by name, and documenting the sequence of the filing date discrepancy. I looked at Mr. Hugh. Can you confirm the complaint has been received and logged? He confirmed it. He gave the case number. He noted, for the record, that the mandatory hold on the licensing file remained in place, and that no transfer of any kind could proceed until the complaint review was complete, a process estimated at a minimum of 60 days. Vuong said nothing. He had not said anything since Mr. Hugh arrived. I folded my hands on the table, and I looked at my son-in-law, and I thought of the morning he had said, without lowering his voice, that I was too old to understand paperwork. I thought of how he had said it with the easy confidence of a man describing something obvious, a fact so settled it required no qualification, an old woman, a drawer full of documents, a system she could no longer navigate. I thought of how he had looked past me while he said it, to my daughter, as though I were a piece of furniture being discussed rather than a person being dismissed. I did not say any of that. Instead, I said only this: I filed the paperwork that built this business before you were old enough to sign your own name. I have protected official documents from errors more serious than yours for 30 years. And I found your forgery in 4 weeks, from a hospital recovery, using only what I already knew. The room was very quiet, not the strained quiet of people waiting for someone to speak. The settled quiet of a thing that has been completed. Tram was looking at the table. My sister was looking at Vuong. Mr. Hugh was writing something in his folder. Lan Vuong sat with her hands resting lightly on her own documents, her expression professional and still. Vuong looked at the founding license on the table between us. He looked at it for a long time. The seal caught the afternoon light coming through the window, and I thought of Duke Thun standing in the street looking up at the green awning on the day the pharmacy opened, saying, "Now it is real." It was still real. It had been real all along. No notation, no void declaration, no briefcase of rehearsed documents could undo what had been built with honest work and filed honestly and carried through the rain by a woman who understood, then as now, exactly what she was doing. "You have 2 choices," Mr. Hugh said, his voice measured and quiet, addressing Vuong now with the tone of someone explaining procedure to a person who has just become a subject of it rather than a user of it. Voluntary withdrawal of the transfer application before the review board reaches its finding, which carries no criminal referral, or allow the review to proceed, in which case the complaint becomes part of the public administrative record and the findings on procedural misconduct are referred to the appropriate oversight body. He paused. "Mrs. Ngo has agreed to accept the first option, if you choose it before we leave this room today." I watched Vuong consider this. I watched him understand what each option cost. I watched him understand, in the end, that neither one returned him to the position he had occupied 3 months ago, when he had believed that an old woman's paperwork was something he could simply reach into and rearrange while she wasn't looking. He chose the first option. Of course he did. He was, underneath everything else, a practical man. He signed the withdrawal form. Mr. Hugh countersigned as witness. Lan Vuong noted it for the file. When it was over, Vuong stood and looked at me one final time, and I looked back at him without anger, without satisfaction, without anything that required a particular expression, only the steady, clear attention of a woman who has spent her whole life learning to read a document at a glance and who had read this one correctly from the very beginning. He left without speaking. The founding license remained on the table between the empty cups, and I rested my hand on it lightly, the way I had rested my hand on important documents 1,000 times across 30 years, confirming that what I was holding was real. It was. The collapse, when it came, did not arrive with a single dramatic moment. It arrived the way most collapses arrive, incrementally, each piece giving way under the weight of the one before it, until what had looked from the outside like a solid structure turned out to have been hollow for some time. Vuong moved out 3 weeks after the Thursday meeting. He did not announce it. One morning I came downstairs and his shoes were gone from the entryway, and by afternoon his car was no longer outside the gate. And that evening Tram told me over dinner, quietly, that he had gone to stay with his brother across the city. She said it the way she said most things about him in those weeks, carefully, without elaboration, in the manner of a woman who has begun the slow, private work of understanding how she got somewhere she did not intend to go. I did not press her. I made rice. I poured tea. I let the house be what it had always been before he arrived, a place where the quiet was comfortable rather than charged, where the incense on the altar burned in the morning without competing with anyone else's agenda for the day. The first piece of the collapse I heard about directly was Bishnok. Lan Vuong called me on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the meeting, while I was at the pharmacy helping Fook with a delivery order. She told me, in the measured tone she used for professional matters, that the Administrative Review Board had completed its preliminary assessment of the procedural complaint and had referred the matter to the Departmental Oversight Committee for further review. The notation Biknuk had entered into the file, founder confirmed cognitively diminished, had been flagged as an unsupported internal entry, made without documentation, without witness, without the medical basis that regulations required. The committee had placed her on administrative suspension, pending the full review. I thanked Lan Vuong and told her she had done careful and thorough work. She said only that the procedures existed for a reason, and that it was her job to make sure they were followed. We understood each other. The second piece arrived through my sister, who heard it through a mutual acquaintance in the financial sector, which is to say, it arrived the way news about financial matters tends to arrive in a neighborhood where people have known each other for 30 years, quietly and completely. Vuong's business. The private investment consulting firm he had operated for the past 2 years had been running primarily on the expectation of capital he had anticipated controlling once the pharmacy transfer completed. Without that capital, without the asset he had been planning to leverage, 2 of his projected clients had withdrawn their commitments, and a third had asked for a formal accounting of the firm's existing resources. There were not many existing resources. There had not been for some time, it appeared. The pharmacy had not been a secondary ambition. It had been the foundation of a financial position he had already begun presenting to others as established fact. I sat with this information for a day before I understood its full shape, and when I understood it I felt not triumph but something closer to sorrow, not for Vuong, exactly, but for the particular waste of it all, the years of careful maneuvering toward a thing that had never been his to take, the relationships he had damaged or discarded in service of a plan that had been built on a document I could see was invalid from across a table. Tram came to me on a Friday evening, after her son was asleep, and sat with me on the porch the way she had not sat with me in the early months after Vuong moved in, when his presence had slowly, without anyone naming what was happening, begun to occupy the space where our old easiness used to be. The tamarind tree was full and dark above us in the night air, and somewhere down the lane a family was having dinner loudly enough that we could hear laughter without making out the words. "I've spoken to someone," she said. "A lawyer. About separation." She was quiet for a moment. "I haven't decided anything yet. I just needed to know what the options were." I told her that knowing the options was always the right first step. She nodded, and we sat together in the dark for a while without needing to fill the silence with anything further. I thought of what it had cost her to do what she did after that meeting, the sworn statement she had provided, the quiet steadiness with which she had sat beside me at the table, while her husband's plan dissolved across the surface it had been built on. She had not been my ally because I had asked her to be. She had been my ally because she had understood, finally and completely, what had been done and who had done it. That understanding had cost her more than anything I had gone through in those weeks, because it had required her to grieve something she had chosen. 3 days later, I heard the last piece. It came from an unexpected direction. Phuc told me, one morning at the pharmacy while we were opening the shutters together and letting the early light into the shop, that a man had come by the previous afternoon asking about the business, not a customer, but someone who identified himself as a potential buyer, who said he had been in contact with the owner about acquiring the property. Phuc had told the man that the owner was not available and that no sale was in process. The man had seemed surprised. He had asked Phuc to pass along a message, a name and a phone number. The name was someone I did not recognize, but the phone number had a prefix I recognized immediately, the same district prefix as Vuong's brother's address, where Vuong had gone to stay 3 weeks ago. Even after the withdrawal, even after the complaint and the suspension and the evaporation of his financial position, Vuong had tried once more, through an intermediary, to put a buyer in contact with a property that was not his to sell, on the assumption, apparently, that the withdrawal had been strategic rather than final, and that some angle remained that I had not yet closed. I stood in the doorway of my husband's pharmacy holding a piece of paper with a stranger's name on it, and I felt, for the first time since all of this began, genuinely and completely finished with being surprised by him. I called Mr. Hugh. I gave him the name and the number and the date and Phuc's account of the conversation, and I told him I thought this was worth including in the file before the committee completed its review. He agreed that it was. He said he would handle it. I hung up the phone and stood for a moment in the middle of the shop, the same shop my husband had opened 31 years ago, with a hand-lettered sign and a green awning and a brass scale for weighing powders, the same shelves in the same arrangement, the same smell of wood and medicine, and the particular dust of a small business that has been open a long time. Phuc was arranging the morning deliveries. The light came through the front window the way it always did at this hour, falling across the counter at the same angle it had fallen for 3 decades. Vuong had looked at this place and seen a number. A leverageable asset. A foundation for a financial position he wanted to occupy. He had never understood, I thought, what he was actually looking at. He had mistaken it for something that could be transferred. He had never understood that some things cannot be transferred. That there are buildings and businesses and pieces of paper that belong to the people who built them, not because of what any document says, but because of what went into the building: the bicycle ride through the rain, the sound of the seal, the hand-lettered sign, the afternoon light falling at the same angle year after year across the same counter. Those things do not move. They do not transfer. They stay exactly where they were put by the people who put them there. And they are still there when everyone else has gone. He had mistaken an old woman's paperwork for something he could understand from the outside. He had been wrong about that from the very first morning, when I had set down the teapot without spilling a drop and given him a smile he had not known how to read. I should have known then, I thought. Anyone who has ever built something real would have. The administrative committee completed its review on a Thursday, exactly 6 weeks after the first Thursday, the one where I had put on my dark blue dye and spread 3 documents across my own table. I did not attend the proceeding. There was no reason to. The documents spoke for themselves, they always had, which had been Vuong's fundamental miscalculation. He had believed that documents were things you managed, things you shaped and positioned and submitted at the right moment to produce the result you wanted. He had never understood that documents, when they are honest, do not require management. They simply are what they are. And when you place an honest document beside a dishonest one and look at both of them in the same light, only one of them holds. Mr. Hugh called me with the outcome that afternoon. The transfer application had been formally nullified. The co-ownership declaration had been struck from the administrative record. Bichnock's suspension had been extended pending a separate disciplinary process by the Departmental Ethics Board. And the founding license for Dukan Pharmacy had been recertified in its original form, with my husband's name on the founding line and my name on the assisting line, exactly as it had been filed 31 years ago in the spring, carried by bicycle through the rain to a counter where a clerk had pressed a seal into paper with a sound like a heartbeat. I thanked Mr. Hugh for his work. He said it was simply procedure, and I said that procedure, when it works the way it is meant to work, is not a simple thing at all. After I hung up, I went to the pharmacy. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of the 3 afternoons a week I came in now, and Fook was behind the counter helping an older woman find something for her joints. I waited until the woman had finished and left, her small bag of medicine tucked under her arm, and then I stood with Fook for a moment in the quiet shop and told him what the committee had decided. He nodded slowly, the way young people nod when they are absorbing something that feels larger than the words describing it. Then he looked around the shop at the shelves his predecessor had arranged, at the brass scale that had come from Duke Than's father's house, at the green awning visible through the front window casting its familiar shade across the step. Good, he said. Just that. Good. I thought it was exactly the right word. I stayed an extra hour that afternoon, going through the quarterly accounts with Fook the way I had been doing more regularly in recent months, not because he needed supervision. He was careful and thorough and had been running the counter for years with real competence, but because I had been thinking, since the Thursday meeting, about what it meant to pass something on properly. What it meant to give a thing to someone in a way that allowed them to understand what they were receiving, not just the legal transfer of it, but the full weight of what it was and where it came from. My husband had understood this. He had named the pharmacy after his father. He had planted the tamarind tree with his own hands, and told me a tree planted by another man's hands doesn't belong to your daughter. He had known that inheritance is not simply property, it is the accumulated meaning of a life passed into the next one. Tram could not run a pharmacy. Her skills were elsewhere, her days already full, and she had enough to carry in the months ahead. But Fook had worked this counter since he was 19. And he had learned the work from someone Duke Than had trained himself, a chain of teaching stretching back to the opening of the shop, and when I watched him help the older woman with her joint medicine that afternoon, I saw in him exactly the quality my husband had looked for in people. The unhurried attention of someone who understood that what they were doing mattered to the person standing in front of them. I had begun, quietly, a conversation with Mr. Hugh about what a formal transfer to Fook might look like. Not a sale, the building would remain in the family, the licensing in our name while I was living, but a managed succession, Something documented and clear and honest, the kind of arrangement that would survive me without requiring anyone to scramble or forge or maneuver. I wanted it done the right way. I had always wanted things done the right way. That had not changed. On a Sunday morning, 3 days after the committee's ruling, I went through the usual ritual of the altar. 3 sticks of incense, lit one from another, placed in the brass holder before my husband's photograph. The smoke rose in its familiar thread, thin and gray, bending slightly in the small current of air from the window, and I stood there in the morning quiet and told him what had been decided and what I was planning. I told him about Fook. I told him the quarterly numbers were good. I told him the green awning needed repainting before the rainy season, and that I had already asked the man at the end of the lane who had done it twice before, and who did good work at a fair price. I told him I thought our daughter was going to be all right, that she was strong in ways she had not yet had occasion to discover, and that discovery, though painful, was not the same as loss. That I had sat with her on the porch and watched the tamarind tree and not needed to say anything, and that not needing to say anything is sometimes the deepest form of understanding between two people who have known each other their whole lives. I told him I was well, that the house was quiet in a good way now, the way it had been before, when the silence in it belonged to us and not to the effort of maintaining a performance for someone who was watching. The incense burned slowly. The smoke moved without urgency through the morning air of the room. I thought of what my grandmother used to say about the lotus plant, that the flower that opens at the surface carries no trace of the mud that made it possible. I had thought of this during the weeks of gathering evidence and making quiet phone calls and moving through the city on morning buses with documents in my bag. And I had held on to it the way you hold on to something true when the difficulty of what you are doing threatens to make you doubt whether the doing is worth it. It had been worth it. The license was restored. The record was corrected. The name my husband had chosen for the thing he built was still on the door, in the lettering I had watched him arrange 31 years ago, and it would remain there. The lotus does not announce its rising. It grows beneath the surface for weeks, unhurried, in the mud and the dark, drawing everything it needs from what surrounds it without showing a single petal until the moment it is ready. And then, when it opens completely. I had spent my whole life working inside systems that others used carelessly, learning their procedures, their irregularities, their points of failure, not to exploit them but to protect against exploitation, the way a locksmith understands every kind of lock, not to break them, but because that knowledge is what makes them the person you call when a door has been forced. They had come for my papers. They had believed I was too old to understand them. I blew out the incense when it had burned to the right length and returned the brass holder to its place on the altar, and I looked at my husband's photograph one last time before I went to make breakfast. The same rare laugh, the same permanent warmth, the same eyes that had looked at the green awning on the day it opened and known, without needing anyone to confirm it, that what they were looking at was real. And I thought, as I turned toward the kitchen with the morning light coming through the tamarind tree and falling across the floor of my house in the pattern I had known for 30 years, still water runs deepest, and in the end, it always finds its way. To every mother and father who has been made to feel invisible in their own life, your years of quiet work, your patience, your knowledge, and your love are not weakness. They are the foundation that everything else is built on, and no one, no matter how clever or how bold, can take from you what you truly understand. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet strength of people who refuse to give up what is theirs. We would love to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe that patience and wisdom will always outlast greed, or have you seen it go the other way?